Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. My name is Chase Robinson and I'm the president of the Graduate Center, but I'm also an historian. I'm a specialist, as it happens, in early Islamic history. And so what that means is that I'll presume to be among friends. And I'll spare you the detailed introduction that I might ordinarily make to the Graduate Center. Suffice it to say that we are a graduate school of arts and sciences, a center of advanced learning, scholarship, and research, a platform for public discussion, debate, and performance, and the doctoral granting heart of the extraordinary enterprise that is the City University of New York, with its 280,000 students pursuing degrees and another 250,000 students doing non-degree work. Ours is a remarkable faculty, and as part of their training, our students teach about 200,000 CUNY undergraduates every year, bringing the very best research and learning to virtually every neighborhood in every borough of the city. What a bracing and important moment in, and I think for, the study of slavery in the Civil War. And what better way to set the scene than by setting the words of another historian, the celebrated Marc Bloch, words that I regard to be especially apposite this evening. The nature, he wrote, the nature of our intelligence is such that it is stimulated far less by the will to know than by the will to understand. And from this, it results that the only sciences which it admits to be authentic are those which succeed in establishing explanatory relationships between phenomena. The rest is, as Malebranche puts it, mere polymathy. Now, as many of you will know much better than I, we are in the midst of a fast-moving revolution in the way historians think about slavery, about anti-slavery, and the Civil War. Generations of historians have marginalized the abolitionists and ignored or dismissed the idea that the Civil War had anti-slavery origins. That familiar orthodoxy is now crumbling before our eyes. Intellectual battle lines are being redrawn, and books published 5 years ago suddenly seem obsolete. This conference organizes, advertises, and celebrates that revolution. And you'll understand if I cannot resist saying that the Graduate Center is at the vortex of the historiographic upheaval taking place. We can boast a past that includes Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Lawanda Cox, Hans Dreyfus, Richard Wade, Herbert Gutman, Eric Foner, and Jack Diggins. We can boast a present that continues that tradition with several colleagues, including, but certainly not only, Jonathan Sasse, David Waldstreicher, and Jim Oakes, in addition to several students. The program looks extraordinary across the board. It assembles a remarkable group of scholars and students, all working in a variety of state-of-the-art approaches. You'll indulge me, however, if, as an historian of early Islam, I make a special plug for the second paper in the second session. Like the Veiled Prophet of Khorasan, Salmon P. Chase and the Meaning of the Anti-Slavery Platform, which will be presented by our own Joe Murphy. There on that throne to which the blind belief of millions raised him sat the prophet chief, the great Mukanna, o'er his features hung the veil, the silver veil, which he had flung. So wrote Thomas More, the mid-19th century Irish poet, alluding to the late 8th century prophet revolutionary in what was then an early Islamic empire. Who knew, certainly not I, who knew how intertwined were American slavery and politics, European Romantic poets, and Abbasid sectarianism? One of the most famous of those romantics, Shelley, wrote that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Even a historian might grant that. I would now like to introduce Jim Oakes, one of our most distinguished faculty members who will have the honor of introducing tonight's keynote speaker. Jim Oakes is one of the leading historians of 19th century American history. He has an international reputation for path-breaking and idol-smashing scholarship. In a series of influential books and essays, he's tackled the history of the United States from the Revolution through the Civil War. His pioneering books include The Ruling Race, Slavery and Freedom, an interpretation of the Old South, The Radical and the Republican, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and the Triumph of Antislavery Politics, and Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States, 1861 to 1865. The latter two garnered, respectively, the 2008 and the 2013 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, an annual award for the finest scholarly work in English on Abraham Lincoln or the American Civil War. An alumnus of Baruch College, Professor Oakes holds MA and PhD degrees from the University of California, Berkeley. He's been on the faculty of the Graduate Center since 1997 and the holder of the Humanities Chair since 1998. Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Oakes.
It's a good thing I don't have to give a speech tonight. I'd never live up to that. Before we begin, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have the pleasant obligation of thanking many of the people and institutions that made this conference possible, beginning with my co-organizer, John Stauffer, who instantly agreed with me that this was something we should and could and, in fact, needed to do. And has been with me since the beginning. John succeeded in getting his home institution of Harvard to co-sponsor this conference. The New York Historical Society also co-sponsors this conference, and we'd like to thank Louise Muir for that. But mostly, I would like to thank personally my home institution, both the City University of New York, the previous interim chancellor of which was generous in his support for this conference, and my home institution here, the Graduate Center, beginning with Chase, the provost, Louise Lenahan, and in particular, Don Robotham of the Advanced Research Collective. These people all co-sponsored it, made it possible, and I want to thank them from the bottom of my heart. They made it easy and expressed enthusiasm right from the beginning. Finally, I need to thank Joe Murphy, who handled all the details and made this whole thing even easier. So thank you all. It is an honor and also a pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speaker, David Blight. David is the class of 54, right? 54, right? 54. I presume that's 1954. Professor of history at Yale. Could be 18. It's Yale. It could be 1754. Professor of history. He is the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Resistance. I'm not sure I got the title right. Is that right? That's close enough. What's impressive to me about David is how many different hats he wears and how well he wears them. I mentioned that he's the director of the Gilder Lehrman Institute, and in that capacity, he, as a kind of academic administrator and intellectual entrepreneur, he has maintained that center the very highest standards of intellectual achievement, and made it and kept it as probably the leading center for the study of slavery and anti-slavery, probably in the world, I think. And he's been very successful at that. And almost everyone in my field has, in some way or another, benefited from that. He is also a very distinguished scholar in his own right, and even as a scholar, he wears several different hats. He is, to my mind, one of the two or three, if not the leading students of Frederick Douglass, the great the great 19th century abolitionist, probably the most prominent African American in the 19th century. And he has a new book coming out on Frederick Douglass. He is also a leading promoter and presenter to the world of slave narratives, an expert on slave narratives and slave autobiographies, but he's best known to scholars as a student of the memory of the Civil War, most particularly in his magnum opus, Race and Reunion, on the way the Civil War was remembered and misremembered in the late 19th and early 20th century, an issue we continue to live with to this day. And finally, David wears another hat that is at least as important. He is one of those rare academic historians who manages and is committed to translating the work of the scholarly academic field to a broad public audience. You've all seen him on TV 1,000 times. He is, every time I email him or talk to him, he's going to some place, giving a talk here, giving there. He speaks at museums and a million different kinds of public venues, and he is masterful at that. And it's one of the most important things a scholar can do, and one of the things he does so successfully. So with that, let me introduce to you tonight's speaker. He's the ideal person to introduce this conference. We're thrilled that he was able to do it. David Blight.
Well, thank you, Jim. President Robinson, any event that begins with a quote from Mark Bloch is kind of downhill from there. A hero, or ought to be a hero to all of us. Mark Bloch, that is. Thank you, Jim, for that amazing introduction. In case there's any confusion, I was not part of the class of '54 at Yale. I was in swaddling clothes, but I've been introduced several times, well, actually twice, when somebody looked over afterward and said, "And you're looking very good, sir." I thought that's where this was going, so but Jim can count better than that. I have no good idea why I'm invited to give this keynote. Any number of 10 others here could have. In fact, I tried to recommend that to Jim when he asked me to do this in a vulnerable moment when I was feeling safe and comfortable in England writing my book. Okay, it's a long time away. But of course, when you plan a conference around your own great ideas and your own big project, you can't be your own keynote. So Jim had to have somebody, I'm filling in for Oakes tonight. And no jokes, Sean. I know Jim Oakes and you're no Jim Oakes. I know, that's what you're thinking, I know. Anyway, this afternoon, I had the pleasure of attending, none of the rest of you, other than the dozen or so people giving papers at this conference, could attend what was a seminar over at the New York Historical Society by virtually all the people giving papers tomorrow. They had shopped their papers with each other, read them all ahead of time. I had not read them all ahead of time because I just didn't get time, but it was amazing. It was it was one of those transcendent 2.5 hours in some ways where we just debated where this story of anti-slavery origins of the Civil War in the long term is going and where it ought to go with the book that Jim and John are going to edit out of this conference. It really was. And actually it was at least 2 generations in that room, in this field. I say at least, I don't want to accuse anybody of being the oldest in a 3rd generation, because I'm getting there myself. But it was a special moment for me in that sense. I'm sure the rest of you might have thought it too. Now, there's an array of abolition scholars here tonight that many of you know. So if I don't quote you, it's because I didn't have space, and if I do, no offense. For historians, wrote Isaiah Berlin in a famous essay turned into a book in 1954 called Historical Inevitability. For historians, wrote Isaiah Berlin, determinism is not a serious issue. Yet, unthinkable as it may be as a theory of human action, specific forms of the deterministic hypothesis have played an arresting, if limited, role in altering our views of human responsibility. Now, a lot of you have read Berlin, and you know he had particular concerns about certain kinds of determinism at that point in history. But my concern in this talk tonight, for better or worse, is the way, perhaps often unwittingly, forms of determinism and forms of moral certainty can creep into our interpretations of this huge, old, extremely important question of just how and why the Civil War happened when it happened. Moral certainty. Minutia, I'm going to use an example out of fiction. You'll approve, I hope, anyway. In the novel by Geraldine Brooks, that some of you surely have read, it was justifiably popular, a book called March. If you've read it, you remember it's a rewriting of Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Main character March is Louisa May Alcott's husband. And there's a scene where Marmee, who is sort of the Louisa May Alcott character, is throwing this kind of spirited, moralistic near fit just before they're all about to go walk up the street to hear a speech by John Brown. And she just is in everybody's face because some of them don't want to go hear John Brown. He's just too radical. He's too crazy. They can't abide. And she's in everybody's face. And March, her husband, is getting really upset, as he always does, at the spirit of his wife and her radicalism. And then Geraldine Brooks takes us into the scene where John Brown is giving a speech in Concord, Massachusetts, on his fundraising campaigns among the abolitionists. And we hear this quote from John Brown. "I tell you this," says John Brown. This is fiction. "The two most sacred documents known to man are the Bible and the Declaration of Independence. Better that a whole generation of men, women, and children should pass away by violent death than that a word of either should be violated in this country." This drew a scattering of applause in the voice of March now, the narrator. A scattering of applause, he says. "Although not from me," he announces. "I was not so profligate with the lives of women and children as he. I glanced at Marmee, but instead of the disapprobation I expected, her black eyes were warm and approving. Here, then, was a man intemperate as she, a man whose measure matched her own. Lifting up his voice, Brown proclaimed that he had no doubt it would be right in opposing slavery not only to accept a violent death, but also to kill. I felt my face settle into a scowl at this. If there is one class of person I have never quite trusted, it is a man who knows no doubt." And of course, the great irony of that moment in the book is that March, who goes off to be a chaplain in the Union Army, becomes exactly that, a man with no doubt. And his abolitionism, his radical abolitionism, his inability to understand why people just don't get it, that the war is all about slavery, gets him into one terrible situation after another and eventually all but kills him. Most of us have spent much of our lives, at least the historians here, studying and essentially admiring abolitionists, and I'm one of them, for their righteousness, their far-seeing demands that America immediately or even gradually end the evil of slavery, remake its institutions, reform its hearts, conquer its racism. They formed the prototypical American radical reform movement. And in our broad historical memory, they won. At least they won in the decades following the 1960s rehabilitation of their reputation. Indeed, it is sometimes remarkable how many of today's right-wingers, who do not really believe in government or racial equality or an openness to immigration or genuine democracy at the ballot box or federal supremacy over states' rights or science and research, and that could go on, will, when they have to in public forums, declare themselves descendants of the abolitionists. We are all abolitionists now, in case you haven't noticed. As long as we keep the subject superficial, triumphal, and somehow in the service of American exceptionalism, that term that is once again getting another riotous revival. It is always worth recalling how unpopular abolitionists were in their own time, lest we forget. It's also worth remembering or asking how many of us would ever want to spend a week, a month, or even a long day out on the lecture circuit in all those stagecoaches and sooty railroad cars and the backs of wagons behind stinking horses with some of the most doctrinaire of the abolitionists. As skeptical scholars and teachers, even if activists in our own ways, we would not have found it an easy time, necessarily, to be next to Stephen Foster, Abby Kelly, Parker Pillsbury, Maria Weston Chapman, or maybe even William Lloyd Garrison himself at times, although he could be charming. Even Frederick Douglass, few of us would have wanted perhaps to be around the embittered personal and ideological rivalries that went on between him and, say, the black Garrisonians, such as Charles Ramon. It is remarkable how they could condemn each other viciously one day and appear at the same lectern the next. They did manage. And when Douglas flared his nostrils, thumped his fist on pulpits and rostrums, and let forth the rage inside of him at slavery and its defenders, we might not want to be on the receiving side. Angry, doctrinaire, absolutist, idealist, especially those scarred by slavery itself, were rarely easy companions. Moral absolutists can surely inspire us, but they're not always fun. In his entry in Who's Who, the late Nathan Huggins, a marvelous historian some of us here knew, and a mentor to me at a time in my life, wrote this about our craft. "I find," said Nathan, "in the study of history, the special discipline which forces me to consider peoples and ages not my own. It is the most humane of disciplines, and in ways the most humbling, for one cannot ignore those historians of the future who will look back on us in the same way." I had that feeling this afternoon sitting in this amazing seminar we were having, charting this new book of essays, this rich, incredible new work on abolitionism, and thinking, 25 years from now? Well, some of us will be dead, but there will be another group of historians looking back on us and thinking, God, they got this wrong and they got that wrong. How could they not realize, geez. I've always loved Nathan's call for humility in what we do. We may all be abolitionists now, and we certainly all are revisionists, of course, in one way or another. And we love a good interpretive fight. Our question here this weekend, the origins and causes of the Civil War, underlying, long-term and immediate, has long had fundamental and fruitful disagreement. Moreover, if we admit it, we are all probably in this field because it is a history completely intertwined with the central drama of our country's past: slavery, emancipation, and the war and Reconstruction that reinvented, destroyed first the original United States and had to reinvent another. It's a field where we've always had commitments to make. I can still remember being accused in a graduate seminar of practicing history as a neo-abolitionist because of the subjects I chose by a student who chose other subjects. And I don't remember now, never trust your memory, but I don't remember how I reacted to that. I was probably proud. Ooh, hadn't been called that before. I also hadn't read Reinhold Niebuhr yet by then. In 1949, Niebuhr left this caution about how we make judgments about history and justice. The processes of historical justice, said Niebuhr, are not exact enough to warrant the simple confidence of the moral character of history. Moral judgments are executed in history, but never with precision. Every execution of moral judgments in history, said Niebuhr, is inexact because of its necessary relation to the morally irrelevant fact of power. In January and February 1863, Frederick Douglass took an extraordinary speech on the road and delivered it many times across parts of the North. The address is entitled "The Proclamation and a Negro Army," and he gave it here in New York to a huge audience at the Cooper Institute in February. Of the thousands of times Douglass stepped to a lectern, a church pulpit, on a stump, or held forth under a tree in a field, this speech ranks among, in my humble opinion, his 4 or 5 most important and revealing. It is not quite the rhetorical masterpieces of structure and argument of the 2 great Jeremiads, the 4th of July speech or the Freedmen's Memorial speech that he gave in 1876, but as a statement about that historical moment right after the proclamation, of his own historical worldview, and of the anti-slavery origins as well as character of the Civil War in its midst. It's a remarkable work. This is the speech where Douglass assessed the meaning of the Emancipation Proclamation right after Lincoln had issued it. 22 years after first entering the formal public anti-slavery movement, the 45-year-old Douglass called emancipation, including Lincoln's edict, the greatest event of our nation's history, if not the greatest event of the century. This is, as many here know, this is poignant given the things Douglass had said about Lincoln in the previous year and a half or so of the war. He said he could scarcely conceive of a more complete revolution. It was, he said, as though England was no longer ruled by a king, Austria had become a republic, and the Pope had turned Protestant. Because of the proclamation, Douglass declared himself a citizen. I stand here tonight not only as a colored man and an American, but as a colored citizen, having in common with all other citizens a stake in the safety, prosperity, honor, and glory of a common country. Just whether he was truly a legal citizen at that moment was yet to be determined. Then came a line in the speech so often quoted by us, by historians. We love to quote this passage. "We are all liberated by this proclamation," proclaimed Douglass. Everybody is liberated. The white man is liberated. The black man is liberated. The brave men now fighting the battles of their country against the rebels and traitors are now liberated. I mean, he had a point. And after these opening strokes of celebration, Douglass got down to some philosophy and some interpretation of the history they were living. He went on at length to lay out his millennialist and apocalyptic vision of history, a quite deterministic conception of human affairs, driven by what he called the laws of God and the laws of nature, and a doctrine of progress that flowed ultimately out of breaks in time, rendings and destructions from which peoples and nations find regenerations and new beginnings. Douglass was a determinist. And Douglass never lacked for moral certainty in these matters. He spoke over and again as though America was playing out a tragic, irrepressible destiny of conflict. A moral chemistry, he said, his words, was at work, forcing Southern slaveholders to stand up to slavery. Their dream and delusion of a slaveholders' republic he portrayed as a kind of gift from history. This tremendous war, he said, is but the ripened fruit of past condition, our present, horrible as it is, the legitimate child of our previous condition. History, according to Douglas, was happening by some mysterious but inexorable design. Drawing from his old and deep King James biblical well of ideas and stories, Douglas announced, "I believe in the millennium, the final perfection of the race, and hail this proclamation, though wrung out under the goading lash of stern military necessity, as one reason of the hope that is in me. It is a grand moral necessity." The speech is also an especially poignant example of Douglas as the bloodthirsty war propagandist that he gladly became in 1861 to 1863, as well as this grand apocalyptic sense of the war. But embedded in its middle is one striking non-deterministic statement about abolitionists and the coming of the Civil War. The passage merits reading as a kind of caution for the entire topic of this conference. "History will accord the abolitionists," said Douglas, "a large measure of wisdom and heroic courage and fortitude in assailing slavery in its strongholds of church and state, but it cannot award to them that prophetic vision that sees the end from the beginning. It is fortunate," Douglas went on, "I think, that they did not see it. Fortunate that they walked by faith and not by sight." Here he seemed to be saying that it was good that they, abolitionists, could exploit the political and moral aftermath of Antietam, but not have to see it. Know about Fredericksburg, but not witness the burial crews on the slopes above the Rappahannock. Could they have foreseen their country torn, said Douglas, and rent by the giant footsteps of this terrible rebellion? Could they have seen 1 million men confronting each other, discussing the question of slavery with cannons? Could they have seen the rivers red with blood and the fields whitened with human bones? They might have shrunk back from the moral contest and thus only have postponed this contest to a future day and on a more dreadful scale than the one now going on. Was Frederick Douglass an early revisionist? No, not really. But here is that kernel of the old needless war revisionist school of thinking. Could not this monstrous problem have been settled with less slaughter and cost of life? At least as a question. In 1980, in the preface to Kenneth Stamp's book of essays called The Imperiled Union, and as he was introducing his own very important essay in that book called The Irrepressible Conflict, Stamp wrote, quote, Kenneth Stamp, Jim's mentor, "Sooner or later, a historian with my teaching and research interest is bound to try his hand at explaining what really caused the Civil War," and he underlined really. It would appear that one of Stamp's most distinguished students, our host, Jim Oakes, has now really done just that. Stamp acknowledged that the question, or that's what we're here to debate anyway. Stamp acknowledged that the question of the war's irrepressibility or inevitability was already then, he said, an old one, and that historians had argued it, he said, to near exhaustion. This was 1980. But he forged on for 55 pages, claiming that the historiographical debate was then worth having because, one, it had such important public dimensions outside the academy, God does it still, and two, his generation, he said, had not yet resolved it, and three, because embedded in each element of the irrepressible question were somehow the ultimate answers of Civil War causation. Are Stamp's suggestions and claims about the historiographical saliency of the irrepressible conflict still true today? 34 years later, this problem is an even older one, And haven't we too argued it to near exhaustion? Apparently not. Here we are. If there's one thing we ought to all read, and there are many things we ought to all read or reread, when contemplating the overall question of this conference, it might be Stamp's essay, Irrepressible Conflict. It's worth going back to. Historiographical essays are rarely a great read, except to the nerdiest of us historians. We write those for each other. But this one is a tour into and out of this deterministic concept, which is what Stamp called it, of repressibility or irrepressibility, and therefore of all those counterfactual questions that have always driven it. Stamp's primary subject is revisionism, that awful, unfortunate label that stuck to a certain school of historians, which means the needless war, repressible conflict school of interpretation of the American Civil War, made so prominent for decades by Avery Craven, James Randall, Frank Owsley, Charles Ramsdell in the 1930s through the 50s, even into the 60s, and to some extent by David Potter, David Donald, and Michael Holt beyond the 60s. I hope Mike's not here tonight, because I'm going to quote him. It is so easy now to dismiss their arguments, those old revisionists, about a blundering generation of fanatical politicians of the 1850s, pious cranks, as Avery Craven called them, contending for power and place, but not really arguing about any real issues. The original revisionist Stamp reminded us back there in 1980 were the 1850s politicians, especially Stephen A. Douglas, who led a cadre of moral indifference about slavery and its territorial future. Stephen Douglas would become a kind of hero among those modern revisionists who saw a sectional conflict that should or could, in their view, have been compromised, were it not for scheming and ambitious politicians bent on using polarization to gain power, especially those northern radicals. And what were they revising, of course? They were revising the then decades-old interpretation that goes back well into the 19th century that the Civil War came about as an irrepressible conflict between two evolving, clashing cultures and societies, one rooted in slavery and the other in free labor. That slavery cultural thesis, as Stamp called it, was also as old as the 1850s, as witness William H. Seward's famous speech on the irrepressible conflict, reinforced by James Ford Rhodes in the 1890s to the early 20th century, and culminating in, among other works, Allan Nevins' great 8-volume Ordeal of the Union, which Stamp called a monument to the slavery cultural concept. What really caused the Civil War to those needless war folks? Many in here know this. Agitation by radical abolitionists was, of course, their answer. Yes, they blamed the abolitionists for the coming of the war. Whether of the Garrisonian or the political abolitionist brand, they engineered a bitter verbal assault of exaggerated and violent abuse, according to one revisionist. For Avery Craven, the Antislavery Origins of the War was a matter of tracing, he said, the steps by which the South was pounded into self-consciousness and moved to ultimate secession. The abolitionists made them do it. The South's increasingly militant response to the North happened only, said the revisionists, to repel a fanatical attack. Propaganda, by what Michael Holt once called the party gladiators, was the real root of the conflict and eventually of the war. The compromisers could not be heard over the din of irrational fury. The horrors of war and the traditionally dismal view of Reconstruction as a colossal failure led those historians of their generation, according to Don Fehrenbacher, to this revolt against determinism. The war was repressible, avoidable, and they had plenty of counterfactuals in their arsenal. But Kenneth Stamp turned all the blundering generation idea on its head with his own long litany of counterfactuals in reverse. The real irrational, abnormal blunderers, said Stamp, were the Southern politicians, the fire eaters bent on independence to protect slavery and racial order. Revisionists were by and large apologists for the South and for a pro-slavery society, argued Stamp. It was Southerners who would have had to alter their tone and tenor and purpose in defense of slavery. They would have had to fundamentally change the treatment of slaves themselves. And had they stayed in the Union and waited for the next election, rather than secede after Lincoln's victory, the Republican Party, argued Stamp, would have been weak and ineffectual. But fear and race control drove them to their revolution and Americans into war. Was it all inevitable in the end? Stamp finally asked. The conflict, yes, he said, but the war itself, not necessarily. And then after 55 pages, he said the question was unanswerable. Sometimes it's what we still say. In that same year, 1980, pardon one little personal story, I was a teaching assistant for Richard Sewell at the University of Wisconsin. I brought Dick's book tonight. One day, Dick came to observe me in my section as a TA. I have a couple former grad students here tonight who probably remember the day I came to your class. I hope this didn't happen. We were that day in Dick's class, in my section, we were assessing Lincoln's secession and emancipation. God, it was my favorite subject. And by that year, Dick was assigning Stamp's Imperiled Union, the essays. That day in my section, I conducted what seemed like a fantastic discussion. Students were really on. They were into it. And I felt so good by the rousing debate. In my gentle but firm direction of them, I had a version of Lincoln the Reluctant Emancipator that I laid on them. And I had pushed them to think about whether the seceding South in 1861 had misunderstood Lincoln and the Republicans' pledge to not threaten slavery in the existing states. I may have been, I suppose, even arguing that on some level, wasn't this all just some horrible misunderstanding in 1861? At that time, I was a relatively fresh, and one might add, fairly ignorant, former high school teacher out of 7 years of high school teaching, and only getting my feet with the historiography of the politics of abolition and emancipation as it stood circa 1980. There might have been some kind of Vietnam generation view of war that came out of me that day. I don't know. Never trust your memory. But on the way back to Dick's office, I do remember, he complimented me on running a good section and being a mature teacher and yada yada. And I was really feeling good. And then he said in his gentlemanly way, "Come into my office." He softly but unmistakably prodded me about this business of the reluctant emancipator. Dick said something to the effect, "You should really reconsider that idea." And when it comes to secession especially, the Southerners actually interpreted Lincoln dead right. Then he gave me a paperback copy of his master work, Ballast for Freedom, Antislavery Politics in the United States, which he just published 4 years earlier. And he said something like, "You might want to read that when you have time." And I did. Rereading Sewell in anticipation of this has been rewarding, to say the least. Dick's now 85 and in decent health, and I can't wait to send him this piece, I think. I'm not sure if I'm going to send him this piece. Especially the final couple chapters of Sewell's work, where he showed, as had Eric Foner before him, the subtle and complex ways that Republicans were a conflicted, if steady, coalition by 1860. Dick exposed how the trickiest issue in explaining Republicans that year, not unlike it would be 2 and 3 years later in the midst of the war, was their simultaneous commitment to free soil, moral antipathy to slavery, and the cordoning off strategy for the territories, but also abiding elements of racism, all in the same coalition. Judgments that whites and blacks could never really live in equality in America sent Republicans careening off into various schemes of colonization, relocating blacks out of the country. A wide variety of Republicans vigorously supported colonization, including Abraham Lincoln. It is true that almost all, Edward Bates was one real exception, believed that repatriation of black Americans somewhere else should be voluntary. Whether it was voluntary usually didn't matter to most blacks, but nevertheless. It is also true that colonization never made it into the Republican Party platform in 1860, although largely due to a strategic decision by Frank Blair and others to avoid a certain fight it would have caused in their ranks. But what was not addressed back in that wonderful 1970s scholarship was just how blacks themselves responded to the Republicans' colonizationist perception of them. The deep white supremacy at the root of so many pro-colonizationist statements by Republicans emerged in language frankly similar to Justice Roger Taney's in the infamous Dred Scott decision, which the Republican Party, of course, vehemently protested, and in opposition to which the party built part of its very identity. Republicans did not have to worry in the least about the cloud of black votes in the North. There weren't that many. Hence, they really did not care how a Frederick Douglass might respond to such pronouncements of Frank Blair's when he said, "Whether as a slave or a free man, the presence of multitudes of the black race is found to be fatal to the interest of our race. Their antagonism is as strong as oil and water." As Sewell says, the language of colonization was never benign. Blair again. "The sable race," he said, "bred in the pestilence of Africa, is a blot on the fair prospect of our country." We have always, for good reason, assessed and judged the Republicans' racial beliefs and policies on many issues within the context of their own times, within the changing patterns of white supremacy. But we have not always assessed them in relation to how black people themselves processed those beliefs and policies in their hearts and minds. Given the choices, the Republicans were a vision of hope, to say the least, in 1860, compared to what Sewell called the brutish Negrophobia of the Democrats. The antebellum Republicans were not freedom riders, as Sewell put it, but they were not Stephen Douglas, or James Buchanan, or Jefferson Davis, or James Henry Hammond either. As Frederick Douglass said in 1860, in that election year, "If the Negro should discriminate between the various organized forces of this country against him, he would point to the Democratic Party as preeminent in unscrupulous malignity and heartless cruelty, attracting to itself all that is low, vulgar, coarse, brutal, and mobocratic in this country." Douglass safely threw his own vote away in New York in 1860, as some of you know, giving it to Gerrit Smith and that minuscule radical abolition party. But he was already a Republican. He cautiously rejoiced nonetheless in Lincoln's success, which had demonstrated, said Douglass, the possibility of electing, if not an abolitionist, at least an anti-slavery reputation to the presidency of the United States. Above all, Dick Sewell's Ballots for Freedom carefully analyzed how there were many efforts at fusion politics in the late 1850s to try to head off this terrible storm, and efforts at various kinds of compromises that might blunt the anti-slavery vision of the Republican Party. Because of fear of disunion and out of genuine conservatism and gradualism on the part of some coalition members, they sought middle ways that in the end just didn't work. By trying to stress local issues, the tariff, the economic impact of the Panic of 1857, and merely by moderating rhetoric, some Republicans thought the ship of state could be saved if Southerners would bend, and all would be well, since slavery in the Western territories might never be a real issue anyway. Horace Greeley, for one, even tried to concoct a whole new party out of Whigs and know-nothing nativists and border state people and just enough Republicans. The eccentric Greeley wanted his border state national ticket, as he called it, to be, and I love this, frankly but inoffensively hostile to the extension of slavery. Misjudgments abounded all around. As it turned out, the overwhelming majority of Republicans essentially rejected all forms of fusion politics on the key issue, slavery's extension, and the idea of property in man. For the Deep South, there was simply no inoffensive hostility to slavery's future. Ultimately, Sewall concluded, using numerous sources, quoting him, that only a platform clearly offensive to slaveholders would satisfy the party's rank and file. Although Sewall did not engage very directly the old irrepressible question, and I can even remember reviews of his book now that wondered why he didn't, he left little doubt that the Republicans' strong stand made the conflict, if not the war, unavoidable. Somewhere between Dred Scott, Harper's Ferry, and the election of 1860, this train wreck had been made unstoppable by human choice. In recent times, variations on a skeptical, avertible war thesis have come from two very distinguished historians of the South, the Civil War, and American literary and cultural history. I doubt one of them is here tonight. One of the other might be. We'll see. Both scholars want us to think, they are, by the way, Edward Ayers and Andrew Delbanco. Both scholars want us to think, again, hard, about any consensus regarding the roots of the conflict, about abolitionism itself. In 2005, Ed Ayers worried that after the combined influence of Jim McPherson's great narrative history, Battle Cry of Freedom, and Ken Burns' PBS film series of 1990, we might collectively, said Ayers, stop worrying about the Civil War altogether. A kind of standard liberal nationalist conception of the war became, in Ayers' view, deeply embedded in our popular memory. I think it was already there to be exploited. The Civil War had become an event with enduring, clear meanings, argued Ed Ayers, thousands of acres of sacred ground demanding some form of redemption, an inspiration to the nation, a bloodletting that made the country greater through suffering. In the popular imagination, the war, Ayers said, could now be protected from cynicism and a kind of national atonement for the huge sin of slavery. Ayers said the flood of new scholarship, especially from the social history revolution, had demolished the old revisionism from the 60s through the 80s. The idea of a needless war had become all but laughable. But what had replaced it, Ayers thought, was an epic that took on the shape, he said, of an elaborate play, a melodrama full of a new load of what Robert Penn Warren had called the treasury of virtue. I quote Ayers, "White Southerners have been permitted limited access to parts of the treasury, handed the keys to the rooms that contain honor, bravery, and maybe even idealism, though not justice. Black Americans have finally been acknowledged as agents in their own freedom, but it is white northern men who come off best in these stories, martyrs for union and the liberty of other people." Now, these are bold strokes by Ayers, a historian I have enormous respect for. And his respectful nod to the old revisionists and their antipathy to moral absolutism is a bit dubious, without also looking at their motives. Indeed, even his lumping of Burns and McPherson into the same neat package might be a little overstated. But when you got an argument to advance, you gotta state it. But he does prod us, and we need it, to keep thinking beyond our comfortable, seemingly self-evident, persistently redemptive stories and plot lines. As for what caused the war, Ayers offers a sophisticated social historian's revival of the old revisionist. He never calls the war needless or avoidable, but in arguing for what he calls deep contingency, Ayers utterly rejects any notion of inevitability and says American political culture in the late 1850s collapsed into a frenzied, his words, misunderstanding, confusion, and miscalculation. There is a certain sweet reason here. The Union did, after all, fall apart. The gears of the northern political mechanism, writes Ayres, spun around many axes, of which slavery was only one, and not always the most important one. Whoa. Now everyone seems to declare for contingency. Who can be against that? That's like being against evidence. But Ayres rewarms the old revisionist idea of a political system fueled by mass market partisan newspapers on an unprecedented scale that itself fostered conflict and war. In an aggressive argument that we should return to the whole modernity problem in explaining the coming of the war, Ayres comes close to saying what James Randall did in The Blundering Generation. Furious politics out of control sent the country into secession as much as any real issue. Ayres, again, quote, maybe the conflict stemmed from a struggle over a hypothetical railroad, a novel written by an obscure woman, an act of symbolic terrorism, and a media war over a distant territory. He concludes that the Civil War must be seen with its taproot in slavery, but can never be understood apart from its many extended roots in print culture, in raging, sensationalized newspaper wars. There is much to fuss with and argue with in Ayres' breezy essays. But as a misanthropic provocateur, he reminds us that nothing is truly inevitable, and we ought never give in completely to the notion that the Civil War came about through a comfortable fable about what he calls a familiar sequence of political events that crashed into one another in a chain reaction like so many billiard balls. For his part, Andrew Delbanco challenges us to think critically all over again about abolitionists and not merely celebrate and appropriate them to our own ends. In the abolitionist imagination, which I thought was by and large brilliant, provocative as well as contrarian, Delbanco's primary concern is the changing reputation of abolitionists over time and how they have so often been a mirror or a test of what is acceptable or effective in radicalism in America. He reminds us that, contrary to now, when the abolitionists are widely, if superficially and nostalgically admired in popular memory, the term was hardly representative of virtue in its own time. As most of us know, their numbers were small, they were widely feared and hated, an opprobrium they often sought, but their influence could be well out of proportion to their numbers. And as Eric Foner has shown, radical abolitionists did over time have profound influence on moderate politicians like Lincoln, perhaps more importantly than they did on ordinary people. But Delbanco troubled some of his respondents by wondering forthrightly why we so easily dismiss those in the late antebellum period who yearned for a middle way, for compromises that might have averted the slaughter of the war. In other words, he too seeks to break us of our habits of thinking about irrepressibility, even as we deny we do. He celebrates Nathaniel Hawthorne's and Herman Melville's oblique approach to slavery, although Melville gets the higher ground there, and he should. Of course, we should pay close attention to literature, from novels to poetry to the slave narratives, as windows into the sectional crises. But Hawthorne and Melville, and I would here add, of course, forcefully Frederick Douglass and others, saw Armageddon coming. The difference is that Douglass wanted, indeed ached for it, where the other writers feared it. Douglass had no good clue the actual form some Armageddon would take, but make no mistake, he wanted it to come. Both Melville and Hawthorne grasped the heart of tragedy and its consequences, unlike so many American historians who just don't like the idea of tragedy and don't know how to write about it. Hawthorne hoped that moderation would prevail, writes Delbanco. This is a quote. Melville, though, expected it. And one might add that the political abolitionists who formed the Republican Party and forged an ideology that did in part drive the nation to conflict and war very much hoped, as Jim Oakes has shown, that moderation would prevail. In the end, they were willing and unwilling makers of that tragedy. And that is why Del Banco reminds us to take seriously the problem of ambivalence in historical action and thought, even if it comes from a Lionel Trilling or an exasperating Edmund Wilson. Wilson's passionate anti-war, instinctively conservative search for anti-centrist, anti-mythic writers and his hatred of moral absolutism in that brilliant, if confounding book, Patriotic Gore, cannot fit nicely, or maybe at all, into our post-civil rights, black history-centered vision of the United States. But there is a great deal of grinding, cruel, terrible human nature to be found by keeping our minds open to that contingency as well. Above all, Del Banco meditates on the recurring idea of an abolitionist disposition, he calls it, or temperament in American history. An interesting idea. And the many forms on left and right that it has taken. Sam Brownback can stand today in the Kansas State Capitol in Topeka in front of those magnificent John Brown murals and try to eliminate taxes in one of the boldest moves of the far right-wing seizure of power in recent years. He, too, claims to be an abolitionist. Unpopular, as it might seem, Del Banco, too, boldly cautions against all those in history who exude moral certainty, who are happy to make moral judgments for the rest of us. Beware all advocates of holy war in any era, he seems to be saying, even if in long retrospect we can pick our winners and we can pick our holy wars with whom or with which we want to ally. Sounding a good deal like Robert Penn Warren on abolitionists for several pages of his essay, Del Banco finally quotes Warren. The abolitionist, wrote Warren in 1961, provided, his words, the saddening spectacle of men courageously dedicated to a worthy cause, letting their nobility grow so distempered by impatience, and sometimes it is difficult to distinguish love of liberty from their lust of blood. Warren, if you didn't know, didn't like abolitionists. One person's distempered impatience, however, is another's justifiable outraged anger and heroism. But Warren did capture quite accurately in that passage what Frederick Douglass had become in the late antebellum period, an advocate of righteous collective violence in the service of emancipation and a fierce promoter of war on the South and slaveholders once Fort Sumter came, although he'd been rehearsing that a long time. Even more than Del Banco surmised, just a couple of years ago, recent books showing a darker and even more destructive Civil War than we might have long imagined may or may not make us reconsider the nature of that abolitionist disposition. Ironically, Del Banco asked the same question Douglas did in his earlier 1863 speech. He asked his readers, especially baby boomers of the Vietnam generation, to become a we, he says, in 1861. Quoting Del Banco, "If we could have known in advance the scale of the ensuing carnage, would we have sided with those who considered any price worth paying to bring an end to slavery? Or would we have voted for patience, persuasion, diplomacy, perhaps economic sanctions, the alternatives to war that most liberal-minded, I'm still quoting, most liberal-minded people prefer today in the face of manifest evil in faraway places?" And Andy wrote that, of course, well before any of us had ever heard of ISIS. So did the abolitionists cause the Civil War after all? I will end with this. Especially the political ones. Yes, forcefully, however often unwittingly, argues Jim Oakes. In his tour de force, Freedom National, and now in the more succinct book, The Scorpion's Sting, Antislavery and the Coming of the Civil War, Oakes demonstrates more thoroughly than anyone before how the Republicans of the late 1850s devised an ideology and a strategy that would draw a legal and political cordon around slavery, restricting its expansion, eliminating it wherever federal jurisdiction ruled, and ultimately bringing it to an ultimate extinction in Lincoln's famous words. Although Oakes, too, argues that nothing is utterly inevitable in history, and that counterfactuals are ultimately not very useful, he makes an aggressive argument about how irreconcilable, his favorite word that he uses over and over, irreconcilable the sectional conflict was, even if the war was not. I think what we have here is the irrepressible conflict once again, but maybe on steroids. The Republicans believed that the slave society of the South would ultimately die by this scorpion sting, gradually eroding first under outside persuasion and then from the center out, thus killing itself when surrounded by a girt of fire. That scorpion metaphor was indeed used repeatedly by a wide range of Republicans. What Oakes posits is a kind of political abolitionist moral suasion. That's not his term, that's mine. They believed in gradualism. Southern states would themselves abolish slavery, beginning with the border states, and ultimately after an internal anti-slavery party was going to somehow emerge within the Deep South, slaveholders would come to their moral and pragmatic political senses and institute emancipation. My God, what a different American history we would have had that ever played out. This they would do, the Republicans, the Southerners would do, rather than face the horrors of war and a forced military emancipation that would come. This would in the end happen peacefully, so the Republicans believed, without war. Or at least it would be some kind of violence short of war. Oakes argues further that there has been too much emphasis on military emancipation, that is, emancipation by the Union Army, as the ultimate means of abolition, and not enough on this longer-term preparation of the political terrain by Republicans and their predecessors for the preferred scorpion sting or self-immolation theory of abolition. But that is just what it was, a theory, and in some ways an extraordinarily naive theory. This notion of self-emancipation by the southern states due to northern anti-slavery pressures has to rank as one of the most profound miscalculations of American political history. Republicans across the board, says Oakes, took a conciliatory posture during the secession crisis, and people like William Seward and Carl Schurz and many others seem to sincerely believe that somehow an anti-slavery wave of far-sighted reason would sweep over the clear-minded in the South, and abolition, with a preserved Union, would come about without violence and without war. After all their years of banging their heads into and haranguing the slave power, how could they genuinely believe in this theory of homegrown anti-slavery in the slave South? We need to look at that. And were the Republicans really as collectively unified on all these issues as sometimes implied? A majority did support the Corwin Amendment, the pledge of a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right of slave ownership as property in the existing slave states as a potential compromise to stave off war. And what about Lincoln's repeated pledge to enforce the fugitive slave law as long as the fugitives were allowed due process? Some radicals like Frederick Douglas were appalled at this. Quoting Oakes, Republicans clearly understood, he says, that Southerners either had to accept a peaceful program of gradual abolition within the Union or secession followed by the horrors of war and immediate violent military emancipation. Jim is so right when he says intentions do not guarantee outcomes. But is this not reading the ultimate results sometimes backward onto the reality? How many Republicans really had this all figured out? Especially the second part of that equation, that secession would necessarily result in violent military emancipation. Oakes has done a tremendous and provocative service in reading morality back into this historiography, in stressing how the Republicans injected the debate over the right and wrong of property and man deep into the crisis. Jim asserts, viewed in this light, the familiar cliche might easily be reversed. The Civil War was only I'm quoting, the Civil War was only superficially a dispute over slavery in the territories. In reality, it was a fundamental conflict over slavery itself. Okay, thanks for the prod. But the territorial problem, as superficial, clangs a bit. How do we account, then, for the entire free soil impulse? How do we understand Lincoln's own reemergence into politics in 1854 to challenge Stephen Douglas in Kansas, Nebraska? How do we even assess, then, the nature of the Republican coalition, which, let's remember, a white supremacist like David Wilmot willingly joined? Moral certainty is a very slippery thing. Even when we think we have it in our hands, it can fall apart. And especially when we remember we're dealing with deeply divided, flawed human beings. Again, Oakes does force us, though, to see that two fundamentally different conceptions of natural law and natural rights were at stake in the sectional secession crisis. Indeed, that may be the deepest root, ultimately, of a revived, irrepressible conflict thesis, whether we call it that or not. And in his discussion of Republican racial views, is rigorous and open-minded. But the secessionist constant fearful harping on Republican beliefs in racial equality in the boiling political atmosphere of 1861 does not necessarily make it so. In a profound statement, Jim concludes, the irreconcilable conflict over slavery was inescapably an irreconcilable conflict over racial equality. Well, in the long run, that's definitely true. But here's where we have to listen to our own demands for contingency, and I know Jim does. He makes a great argument for contingency. The Lincoln of the Peoria speech or the House Divided speech or the first inaugural is not the same Lincoln as January 1863. Growth and change in the midst of this result, so fundamental and astounding, and the remorseless revolutionary struggle of the war itself, as Lincoln famously called it, have to make us push back at our own tendencies to see ends from beginnings, even as we admit that our subjects could not. Thank you.